The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Maplewood Elementary School parking lot when the impossible happened. Security cameras would later capture it all, a 72-year-old woman in a faded floral dress and worn sneakers doing what 3 grown men couldn't. But this isn't just about a moment of superhuman strength. This is about Margaret Henderson, a grandmother who spent years being told she was too old, too weak, too fragile to matter. This is about how an entire community learned that the most powerful force in their neighborhood had been hiding in plain sight, tending to her garden and baking cookies for school fundraisers. They called her frail. They called her past her prime. They had no idea who they were talking to. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maplewood Village sat tucked between rolling Ohio farmland and the outskirts of Columbus, the kind of place where neighbors still waved from their front porches, and the annual block party was marked on everyone's calendar 6 months in advance. The subdivision had been built in the late 90s, when young families flocked to the promise of good schools and quarter-acre lots where children could play safely. Now 25 years later, those same families had aged into an established hierarchy of influence and opinion, their voices carrying weight at HOA meetings and their approval determining which new residents would truly belong. The heart of this community beat strongest along Elm Street, where pristine sidewalks connected houses that told stories of upward mobility and careful maintenance. Morning joggers formed informal groups based on pace and conversation preferences. Their moisture-wicking athletic wear and fitness trackers, broadcasting their commitment to health and vitality. The younger residents dominated these morning rituals, their energetic conversations about marathon training and CrossFit competitions creating an atmosphere where physical capability was both currency and status symbol. At the corner of Elm and Maple stood the Riverside Fitness Gym, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering passersby a clear view of the serious athletes inside. The facility had opened 3 years earlier, transforming what had once been a failing hardware store into a temple of modern wellness. Chrome equipment gleamed under LED lighting, and motivational quotes in bold typography covered the walls between mirrors that reflected endless repetitions of dedication and determination. The gym had become more than just a place to exercise. It served as an unofficial headquarters for the neighborhood's most influential residents. Sarah Kim, the PT, president and wife of a successful orthodontist, held court during her Tuesday evening spin classes, discussing school board elections and charity fundraiser logistics between intervals. David Martinez, the head trainer whose Instagram account boasted 15,000 followers, had transformed himself into something of a local celebrity, his expertise sought after for everything from youth sports conditioning to weight loss transformations. These were the voices that mattered in Maplewood Village, the opinions that shaped community decisions and determined social standing. They spoke with the confidence of people who had earned their positions through visible achievement and measurable success. Their influence extended far beyond the gym walls, reaching into school board meetings, neighborhood watch programs, and the countless small decisions that define daily life in their carefully curated corner of suburban America. The community center on Oak Avenue hosted monthly HOA meetings where these same faces appeared in the front rows, their concerns about property values and safety protocols given immediate attention and serious consideration. They formed committees, organized events, and generally served as the unofficial leadership council for a neighborhood that prided itself on being well-managed and forward-thinking. Their authority seemed natural, even inevitable, rooted in their obvious competence and demonstrated commitment to community improvement. Yet for all their influence and activity, there existed parallel layers of community life that moved at different rhythms and operated by different rules. The elderly residents who had arrived during Maplewood's earliest days maintained their own networks of connection and mutual support, Though their voices had gradually grown quieter as the neighborhood evolved around them, they attended the same meetings and events, but increasingly found themselves listening rather than leading. Their perspectives treated as charming reminiscences rather than current wisdom. These older residents had created their own informal gathering places and routines. The corner market served as an information hub where conversations moved slowly and covered topics that younger residents rarely considered important. The walking paths around Riverside Park attracted a different demographic in the early morning hours, before the fitness enthusiasts claimed the space for their more intense workouts. Even the library had different sections where different generations felt most comfortable, creating invisible boundaries that reflected the community's subtle but persistent age-based segregation. The physical landscape itself seemed designed to celebrate youth and energy. Playground equipment in the parks featured climbing walls and challenging obstacle courses that required agility and strength. The walking trails included fitness stations, with pull-up bars and balance beams, transforming casual strolls into opportunities for athletic demonstration. Even the community garden plots were assigned based on participation in volunteer activities that favored those with flexible schedules and physical stamina, creating an environment where contribution was measured by visible, energetic engagement. This was the world that had formed around Margaret Henderson without her input or consultation. A community structure that had gradually relegated her to the margins simply by virtue of her age and appearance. She had watched it develop over the 15 years since she moved to Elm Street, observing how influence consolidated around certain types of people while others became increasingly invisible. The changes had happened so gradually that they seemed almost natural, creating a social ecosystem where her presence was tolerated, but not particularly valued. The morning routines that defined Maplewood Village reflected this underlying hierarchy with subtle but consistent clarity. The serious athletes claimed the prime hours for outdoor activities, their presence on sidewalks and trails serving as a reminder of who belonged to the community's active, engaged core. Their conversations carried across the morning air, discussions of personal records and training goals mixing with plans for upcoming races and fitness challenges that would further demonstrate their capabilities and commitment. Coffee shops and restaurants scheduled their busiest hours around these morning athletes, their staff trained to prepare the protein smoothies and energy supplements that fueled the neighborhood's most visible residents. Even the local businesses had adapted their services and marketing to appeal to this demographic, recognizing where the purchasing power and social influence resided. The result was a community that functioned efficiently and prosperously, but only for those who fit its implicit definition of valuable citizenship. This carefully constructed social order operated on assumptions that seemed so reasonable they were rarely questioned. Physical fitness indicated discipline and self-care. Professional success demonstrated competence and reliability. Active participation in community events showed commitment and leadership potential. Youth brought energy and fresh perspectives. These criteria for respect and influence appeared logical and merit-based, creating a system that felt fair to those who benefited from it while remaining largely invisible to those who didn't. The irony was that Maplewood Village had been built on values of family, safety, and community connection, principles that might have suggested a different kind of hierarchy entirely. But the practical realities of modern suburban life had gradually shifted the community toward prioritizing different qualities, creating an environment where certain residents thrived while others simply existed quietly in the background, their own forms of strength and wisdom unrecognized and undervalued. Margaret Henderson had learned to navigate this world with careful attention to its unspoken rules and expectations. She understood her place in the community's social order and had adapted her behavior accordingly, participating just enough to avoid seeming antisocial, while never presuming to claim attention or authority that clearly belonged to others. She had become skilled at the particular kind of invisibility that allowed her to function peacefully within a system that had no obvious place for someone like her. But invisibility, as Margaret was about to discover, could sometimes be its own form of power, especially when the moment came for someone to act while others simply watched and waited for someone else to take responsibility. The community that had taught her to stay quietly in the background was about to learn that they had been overlooking exactly the kind of strength they might need most when everything they thought they knew about capability and courage was suddenly put to the ultimate test. Margaret Henderson's small frame moved through Maplewood Village like a ghost from another era, her presence barely registering in the daily consciousness of her neighbors. At 72, she had perfected the art of existing without taking up space, of contributing without drawing attention, of being helpful while remaining fundamentally unnoticed. Her daily routine began before dawn, when the fitness enthusiasts were still sleeping and the streets belonged to delivery trucks and newspaper carriers who recognized her but never stopped to chat. Every morning at 5:15, Margaret would emerge from her modest two-bedroom house at the end of Elm Street, wearing clothes that told stories of practicality over fashion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her garden shoes, caked with soil from seasons of planting and harvesting, carried her to the backyard where she maintained the most productive vegetable garden in the neighborhood. While others hired landscaping services or installed elaborate irrigation systems, Margaret worked the earth with her bare hands, turning compost, hauling bags of mulch, and maneuvering heavy planters with a quiet efficiency that went completely unobserved. Her neighbors, had they bothered to look, might have been surprised by the scope of her morning labor. Margaret regularly moved wheelbarrows loaded with stones for her expanding garden borders, hefted 40-pound bags of fertilizer from her car to the storage shed, and split firewood for the winter months with an axe that most people would struggle to lift. But these activities happened in the early hours when the neighborhood slept, or in the privacy of her backyard where no one thought to venture. The irony was profound. While David Martinez posted videos of himself deadlifting impressive weights at Riverside Fitness, Margaret was quietly loading 100-pound tree stumps into her pickup truck to clear space for new plantings. While Sarah Kim organized charity walks to promote community health, Margaret was hauling buckets of water across her yard to sustain her vegetable garden during drought periods. The very people who defined strength and capability in Maplewood Village were surrounded by a demonstration of practical power that they never bothered to notice. Margaret's invisibility had been cultivated over years of subtle dismissal and gentle marginalization. It had started innocently enough, with well-meaning neighbors offering to help with tasks they assumed she couldn't handle alone. When she politely declined their assistance, they interpreted her independence as stubborn pride rather than actual capability. Over time, their offers became less frequent, then stopped altogether as they concluded that Margaret preferred to struggle with tasks rather than accept reasonable help. The transformation of Margaret from community member to background fixture had accelerated after her husband Harold died 5 years earlier. Harold had been the more visible half of their partnership, the one who attended HOA meetings and participated in neighborhood discussions. His death had created a social vacuum that Margaret found impossible to fill, not because she lacked opinions or insights, but because the community had already decided what kind of person she was and what kind of voice she might have. At HOA meetings, Margaret would sit quietly in the back rows, listening to debates about parking regulations and landscape standards, with the patience of someone who had learned that her input wasn't particularly welcome. When she occasionally raised her hand to speak, the moderator would acknowledge her with the kind of patronizing courtesy reserved for elderly residents who might have difficulty following complex discussions. Her suggestions, when she made them, were met with polite nods and immediate redirection to more pressing matters. The community had developed an efficient system for managing residents like Margaret. They were included enough to avoid seeming exclusionary, but their participation was carefully contained within acceptable boundaries. Margaret could volunteer for bake sales and holiday decorating committees, activities that utilize her domestic skills while keeping her away from decisions about budgets, development plans, or safety protocols. She could contribute labor and baked goods, but her voice in planning and leadership was gently but consistently discouraged. This marginalization extended beyond official community functions into the informal networks that actually governed daily life in Maplewood Village. The morning coffee groups that formed spontaneously outside the corner market never included Margaret, not because anyone actively excluded her, but because her presence somehow shifted the dynamic in ways that made conversation less comfortable. The impromptu neighborhood gatherings that started in driveways and evolved into barbecues happened around her house but never included it in their natural expansion. Margaret had adapted to this social isolation with the resilience of someone who had faced much greater challenges in her life. She had raised 4 children as a single mother after Harold's military service left him with injuries that prevented consistent employment. She had worked double shifts at steelworks manufacturing for 30 years, operating machinery that required both technical skill and considerable physical strength. She had managed household finances through economic downturns, maintained a home through multiple renovations, and provided care for aging parents while raising her own family. But none of this history was visible to her current neighbors, who saw only a small elderly woman in clothes that suggested limited means and social connections that appeared minimal. They had no context for understanding that Margaret's quiet demeanor came from confidence rather than timidity, that her preference for working alone reflected competence rather than antisocial tendencies, that her modest lifestyle represented choice rather than limitation. The daily rhythms of Maplewood Village reinforced these misperceptions with subtle but consistent messaging. When packages were delivered to Margaret's house, drivers automatically assumed she would need help carrying them inside, often setting them just inside her front door, despite her protests that she could manage perfectly well. When snow needed to be cleared from her driveway, younger neighbors would sometimes take care of it without asking, then mention their good deed to others as evidence of the community's caring nature. These acts of unsolicited assistance, while well-intentioned, had the cumulative effect of reinforcing Margaret's status as someone who required help rather than someone capable of providing it. The neighbors who shoveled her driveway never saw her splitting firewood in the backyard. The delivery drivers who worried about her carrying packages never witnessed her hauling landscaping materials. The community that had decided she needed protection had never bothered to investigate what she might actually be capable of protecting. Margaret's professional background at steelworks manufacturing had given her a relationship with physical labor that most of her neighbors couldn't imagine. For 3 decades, she had operated heavy machinery, moved industrial materials, and worked in conditions that demanded both mental focus and physical endurance. The factory floor had been a place where capability mattered more than appearance, where strength was measured by results rather than presentation, where Margaret had earned respect through consistent performance under demanding conditions. The skills she had developed during those years had never disappeared, but they had become invisible to a community that associated strength with gym memberships and athletic achievement. Margaret's ability to lift heavy objects came from understanding leverage and body mechanics rather than muscle mass. Her endurance came from years of sustained physical labor rather than cardiovascular training. Her problem-solving skills had been honed by machinery breakdowns and production deadlines, rather than fitness challenges and personal records. But these forms of capability didn't translate into social recognition in a community that valued different demonstrations of competence. Margaret's strength was functional rather than aesthetic, practical rather than performative, proven through necessity rather than choice. The very qualities that had made her valuable in her working life made her nearly invisible in her retirement community. The contrast between Margaret's actual capabilities and her neighbors' perceptions had created a strange form of cognitive dissonance that everyone had learned to ignore. When Margaret carried her own groceries, managed her own yard work, and maintained her own home without assistance, her neighbors attributed her independence to stubbornness rather than strength. When she declined offers of help, they assumed she was too proud to accept charity rather than too capable to need it. This dynamic had become so entrenched that it required active mental effort for anyone to question their assumptions about Margaret's limitations. The community had invested too much in their narrative of her fragility to easily accept evidence that contradicted their established beliefs. It was simpler to maintain the fiction that Margaret was managing despite her age rather than acknowledge that she might be thriving because of her experience. The social ecosystem of Maplewood Village had effectively created two separate realities: the visible world where youth and fitness determined influence and respect, and the invisible world where Margaret quietly demonstrated forms of strength and capability that went completely unrecognized. These parallel universes coexisted without intersection, allowing everyone to maintain their comfortable assumptions while remaining blind to the contradictory evidence that surrounded them daily. Margaret had learned to navigate this divided reality with the wisdom of someone who understood that fighting perception was less productive than simply living according to her own standards. She neither sought recognition for her capabilities nor felt diminished by the lack of acknowledgement. Her strength didn't depend on external validation, which was fortunate since none was forthcoming from a community that had already decided who she was and what she represented. But social dynamics have a way of revealing their inadequacies when circumstances shift beyond the normal parameters of community life. The carefully constructed hierarchies that seemed natural and appropriate under ordinary conditions could prove surprisingly fragile when tested by situations that demanded different forms of capability and courage. Margaret's neighbors were about to discover that their assumptions about strength and weakness, about who could be counted on and who needed protection, were based on a very limited understanding of what those qualities actually meant when everything familiar suddenly became uncertain and dangerous. The fitness culture that dominated Maplewood Village had created a particular definition of physical capability that emphasized visible muscle development, athletic achievement, and competitive performance. This definition served the community well for the activities that filled their daily lives: recreational sports, fitness challenges, and the various forms of exercise that had become markers of social status and personal discipline. But it was a definition that had never been tested by genuine emergency, by situations where lives depended on immediate action rather than planned performance. Margaret's own understanding of strength had been forged in circumstances where failure carried real consequences, where there was no audience to impress and no second chances to correct mistakes. Her capabilities had been developed through necessity rather than choice, refined by years of responsibility rather than months of training, proven by results that mattered to survival rather than scores that mattered to ego. The community that had learned to overlook Margaret Henderson was about to face a situation that would reveal the profound difference between strength that looked impressive and strength that actually mattered when everything else failed. They were about to learn that the most important forms of power often came from the most unexpected sources, and that the person they least expected to help them might be the only person capable of doing what needed to be done when the unthinkable happened in their carefully ordered suburban paradise. David Martinez arrived at Riverside Fitness every morning at precisely 6:30, his routine as polished and predictable as his social media presence. The gym's parking lot was already half full by the time his lifted pickup truck claimed its usual spot near the entrance, where other early arrivals could admire the custom modifications that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. David's truck was a statement piece, its oversized tires and chrome accents, announcing its owner's commitment to projecting strength and capability in every aspect of his life. Inside the gym, David commanded attention without effort. At 28, he possessed the kind of physique that fitness magazines featured on their covers, each muscle group carefully developed through years of dedicated training and meticulous nutrition planning. His workout clothes bore logos of premium athletic brands, and his movements through the gym carried the confidence of someone who had never questioned his position at the center of his social universe. The morning crowd at Riverside Fitness represented Maplewood Village's most influential residents, and David served as their unofficial leader and spokesperson. His expertise was sought constantly, his opinions quoted and repeated, his approval coveted by newer members who hoped to earn their place in the gym's social hierarchy. He had transformed himself into a local authority on all matters related to physical fitness, health, and the kind of lifestyle choices that separated serious athletes from casual exercise enthusiasts. David's influence extended far beyond the gym walls through his carefully curated Instagram account, where his 15,000 followers received daily doses of motivation mixed with product endorsements and training advice. His posts featured professionally shot videos of impressive lifts, inspirational quotes overlaid on sunset workout photos, and carefully staged glimpses of his lifestyle that suggested both accessibility and aspiration. He had become a brand. As much as a person, his identity inseparable from his image as a fitness expert and community leader. The comments on David's posts revealed the extent of his local influence. Fellow Maplewood residents tagged their friends, shared his content, and sought his advice on everything from nutrition planning to home gym equipment. His recommendations could make or break local businesses, his endorsement serving as a stamp of approval that carried real economic value. He had achieved the modern version of community leadership where influence flowed through digital networks, as much as face-to-face interactions. But David's authority wasn't limited to fitness advice. His status as a successful entrepreneur, his obvious dedication to self-improvement, and his photogenic lifestyle had elevated him into a role as unofficial spokesperson for his generation's values and priorities. When neighborhood issues arose, David's opinion was solicited. When community events needed organization, David's involvement was expected. When younger residents had concerns about HOA policies or local development, David served as their representative to the broader community. This influence had been earned through consistent demonstration of the qualities that Maplewood Village most valued. David's success was visible, measurable, and easily understood. His client list included local business owners, professional athletes, and social media influencers who paid premium rates for his training services. His own physical transformation from an overweight college student to a fitness model provided a compelling narrative of personal improvement through discipline and hard work. David's morning routine at Riverside Fitness served as both workout and performance, each exercise executed with the precision of someone who understood that his every movement was being observed and evaluated. He moved through his training with practiced efficiency, adjusting weights with casual ease, maintaining perfect form even under maximum load, and completing his sessions with the kind of intensity that left others feeling exhausted just from watching. The younger members of the gym followed David's lead without question, adopting his training methods, purchasing the supplements he recommended, and gradually absorbing his attitudes about fitness, health, and the lifestyle choices that separated winners from everyone else. His influence shaped not just their exercise routines, but their broader worldview, their understanding of what it meant to be strong, capable, and worthy of respect in their community. Sarah Kim often arrived at the gym just as David was finishing his morning workout, timing her appearance to coincide with the moment when his attention was most available for the kind of community, planning conversations that had become central to both of their roles in Maplewood Village. As PTA president and wife of a successful orthodontist, Sarah wielded her own form of influence that complemented David's fitness authority perfectly. Together, David and Sarah represented the neighborhood's power couple, their combined influence extending across virtually every aspect of community life. Sarah's organizational skills and social connections paired seamlessly with David's motivational energy and broad appeal, creating a partnership that had transformed them into the unofficial leadership council for their generation of Maplewood residents. Their morning conversations often centered on planning community events that would showcase the values they both embodied. The annual charity fun run that David organized had become a major social event, drawing participants from across the region while raising significant funds for local causes. Sarah's coordination of volunteer schedules, vendor relationships, and media coverage ensured that these events reflected positively on everyone involved while establishing Maplewood Village as a model of suburban engagement and community spirit. But their influence wasn't always used with such positive intentions. Both David and Sarah had developed a subtle but consistent pattern of dismissing residents who didn't fit their image of valuable community members. Their conversations contained frequent references to neighbors who didn't really understand current issues or who might not be the right fit for certain volunteer opportunities. Their social circles had gradually contracted to include only those residents who shared their values, energy levels, and lifestyle choices. This exclusionary tendency had become particularly pronounced in their attitudes toward the neighborhood's elderly residents. David and Sarah had developed a shared vocabulary of gentle condescension when discussing older neighbors, referring to them as sweet and adorable while systematically excluding them from meaningful participation in community planning and decision-making. Their concern for elderly residents was genuine but paternalistic, focused on ensuring their comfort and safety rather than respecting their autonomy and capability. Margaret Henderson had become a frequent subject of these conversations, her presence in the neighborhood serving as a kind of ongoing puzzle for David and Sarah to solve. They couldn't understand why she declined offers of assistance, why she seemed content with such limited social engagement, why she persisted in maintaining her own yard and home when professional services were clearly more appropriate for someone her age. David had occasionally observed Margaret during his morning runs through the neighborhood, noting her early morning activity in her garden with the kind of casual attention he might give to any unusual sight. But he had never connected her physical activity with any form of real capability, interpreting her gardening and yard work as the stubborn persistence of someone too proud to acknowledge her limitations rather than the routine maintenance performed by someone perfectly capable of managing her own affairs. The disconnect between David's perception and Margaret's reality had become a kind of cognitive blind spot that prevented him from seeing evidence that contradicted his assumptions. When he noticed Margaret carrying bags of mulch or moving garden equipment, he interpreted these activities as proof that she needed help rather than evidence that she was perfectly capable of helping herself. His concern for her safety was genuine, but it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what she was actually doing and why she was doing it. Sarah shared David's concern but approached it from a different angle, focusing on Margaret's apparent social isolation and limited participation in community activities. She had made several attempts to include Margaret in volunteer opportunities that seemed age-appropriate, offering her roles in bake sales and holiday decorating committees that would allow her to contribute without requiring too much physical exertion or complex decision-making. But Margaret's lukewarm response to these invitations had frustrated Sarah, who couldn't understand why someone who seemed lonely wouldn't appreciate opportunities for social engagement and community contribution. Sarah had interpreted Margaret's polite but unenthusiastic participation as evidence of depression or cognitive decline, rather than simply a lack of interest in the particular activities being offered. The generational divide between Margaret And the gym crowd had created a situation where two completely different definitions of strength and capability coexisted without ever directly confronting each other. David's understanding of physical power was based on visible muscle development, measured performance, and competitive achievement. Margaret's relationship with strength was rooted in functional necessity, practical application, and sustained endurance under real-world conditions. These different approaches to physical capability had never been directly tested against each other, allowing both David and Margaret to maintain their respective understandings without challenge or comparison. David's strength was impressive within the controlled environment of the gym, where equipment was designed for safety and performance could be measured precisely. Margaret's strength was effective within the practical environment of daily life, where problems needed to be solved immediately and results mattered more than technique. The community that surrounded them had invested heavily in David's version of strength, celebrating his achievements and seeking his expertise while remaining largely oblivious to Margaret's demonstrations of practical capability. This investment had created a social dynamic where David's influence continued to grow while Margaret's presence became increasingly marginal, setting up a contrast that would soon be tested in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. Frank Russo represented a different category of local authority in Maplewood Village, his influence based on practical skills rather than athletic achievement or social media presence. As the owner of Russo's Auto Repair, Frank had built his reputation through decades of solving mechanical problems that left other technicians scratching their heads. His shop occupied a converted warehouse on the industrial side of town, where residents brought vehicles that other mechanics had declared unfixable. At 45, Frank possessed the kind of practical strength that came from years of wrestling with stubborn bolts, lifting heavy engine components, and maneuvering tools. In cramped spaces where leverage was limited and brute force was often the only solution. His hands were permanently stained with motor oil and scarred from countless encounters with sharp metal edges, marking him as someone who earned his living through physical labor rather than desk work or sales presentations. Frank's clientele included many of Maplewood Village's residents, who appreciated his honest assessments and reasonable prices, even if they didn't always appreciate his direct communication style. He had little patience for customers who tried to diagnose their own mechanical problems based on internet research, and he was particularly dismissive of anyone who seemed more concerned with appearance than functionality when it came to automotive repair and maintenance. The contrast between Frank's practical approach to problem solving and David's performance-oriented fitness philosophy created an interesting dynamic within the neighborhood's informal hierarchy. Frank respected physical capability, but he measured it by results rather than appearance, by the ability to complete difficult tasks under challenging conditions, rather than the ability to look impressive while exercising in controlled environments. Frank had occasionally encountered Margaret Henderson at the corner market or during community events, and unlike many of his neighbors, he had actually paid attention to her behavior rather than simply categorizing her based on age and appearance. His years of experience reading people's mechanical aptitude had given him a different lens for evaluating capability, one that focused on how people approached problems rather than how they looked while doing so. During one memorable encounter at the hardware store, Frank had observed Margaret selecting tools and materials for a home repair project with the kind of systematic approach that suggested genuine expertise rather than hopeful guessing. She had chosen exactly the right combination of fasteners, sealants, and reinforcement materials for what appeared to be a complex structural repair, asking questions that revealed both technical knowledge and practical experience. But Frank's observations about Margaret's competence hadn't translated into broader community awareness, partly because his own social influence was limited to automotive and mechanical issues. His opinion carried weight when neighbors needed advice about car maintenance or home repairs, but it didn't extend into the social and organizational spheres where David and Sarah's influence dominated community decision-making. The division between practical skills and social influence had created separate spheres of authority within Maplewood Village, each valid within its own domain, but rarely intersecting in ways that might challenge the community's established hierarchies. Frank's recognition of Margaret's capabilities remained largely private, while David and Sarah's assumptions about her limitations continued to shape public perception and community planning. This fragmentation of expertise and influence had created a situation where the neighborhood's most capable residents weren't necessarily its most recognized leaders, and where important forms of knowledge and skill remained invisible to those making decisions about community priorities and resource allocation. The result was a social structure that celebrated certain types of achievement while overlooking others, creating blind spots that would soon prove costly when circumstances demanded forms of capability that existed outside the community's recognized areas of expertise. Frank's garage had become an informal gathering place for the neighborhood's more practically minded residents, a space where conversations focused on solving problems rather than impressing audiences. The regulars who stopped by for coffee and mechanical advice represented a different cross-section of the community, one that included retirees who had worked in trades, younger residents who preferred fixing things to replacing them, and various neighbors who appreciated Frank's straightforward approach to both automotive repair and social interaction. These informal gatherings had given Frank insight into aspects of community life that remained invisible to the fitness crowd and social organizers who dominated more official neighborhood functions. He knew which residents were struggling financially, but too proud to ask for help, which elderly neighbors were managing complex health issues while maintaining their independence, and which families were dealing with challenges that didn't fit neatly into the community's preferred narratives of success and prosperity. Margaret Henderson had never been a regular at Frank's garage, but she had brought her aging pickup truck there for maintenance over the years, and Frank had developed a grudging respect for her approach to vehicle ownership. Unlike many of his customers who treated their cars as status symbols or fashion accessories, Margaret understood her truck as a tool and maintained it accordingly. She asked intelligent questions about necessary repairs, declined unnecessary services, and clearly understood the relationship between proper maintenance and long-term reliability. More importantly, Frank had noticed that Margaret's truck showed signs of heavy use that seemed inconsistent with the community's perception of her as a frail elderly resident who rarely left her house. The wear patterns on her tires suggested regular hauling of heavy loads. The scratches and dents on her truck bed indicated frequent transport of construction materials or landscape supplies, and the overall condition of her vehicle suggested someone who used it for serious work rather than occasional errands. But Frank's observations about Margaret's truck use hadn't prompted him to investigate further or share his insights with other neighbors. His relationship with the community was professional rather than social, and he had learned to keep his opinions about customers' personal lives to himself unless directly asked for advice. The result was another layer of evidence about Margaret's capabilities that remained hidden from the broader community awareness. The mechanical challenges that Margaret's truck had presented over the years had also given Frank insight into her problem-solving approach and technical knowledge. When he explained repair options and maintenance requirements, Margaret asked follow-up questions that revealed genuine understanding of mechanical systems rather than polite confusion. She seemed to grasp the relationships between different automotive components and the long-term consequences of various repair decisions in ways that suggested hands-on experience rather than casual interest. These interactions had gradually shifted Frank's perception of Margaret from typical elderly customer to someone who deserved the same respect he gave his most mechanically knowledgeable clients. But this shift had occurred quietly and privately, without fanfare or community recognition, adding to the growing collection of evidence about Margaret's competence that remained invisible to those who most needed to understand what they were overlooking. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Riverside Fitness as David Martinez completed his final set of deadlifts, the weight plate settling to the floor with a satisfying clang that announced his workout's successful conclusion. Around him, the usual collection of early morning athletes continued their own routines, the gym's atmosphere thick with the focused energy of people pursuing physical excellence before beginning their regular workdays. David's post-workout ritual included a protein shake mixed with carefully measured supplements, consumed while he checked his phone for overnight comments on his latest Instagram posts and responded to direct messages from potential clients seeking training advice. This digital engagement had become as important as the physical exercise itself, maintaining the online presence that supported his growing influence within the fitness community and beyond. As he scrolled through his notifications, David's attention was caught by a tagged photo from the previous evening's neighborhood barbecue, where he had been captured mid-conversation with several other Maplewood Village residents. The image showed him in his element, surrounded by admirers and clearly positioned as the center of attention, his confident posture and engaging expression perfectly embodying the leadership role he had cultivated within the community. But the photo also included, in the background, the small figure of Margaret Henderson quietly cleaning up discarded plates and cups while the party continued around her. The contrast between David's central position and Margaret's peripheral activity struck him as oddly symbolic, representing the clear division between those who commanded attention and those who simply performed necessary tasks without recognition or appreciation. David's immediate impulse was to crop the photo to remove Margaret's presence, focusing the image on the central group conversation where he was clearly the dominant figure. But something about her posture in the background held his attention for a moment longer than usual, a quality of efficient movement that seemed inconsistent with his mental image of elderly frailty and uncertain capability. The observation was fleeting, quickly forgotten as David's attention returned to more pressing concerns about his training schedule and client appointments for the day. But the moment had planted a small seed of curiosity that would remain dormant until circumstances forced it to grow into something more substantial and challenging to his established assumptions about strength, capability, and the nature of true leadership when crisis demanded action rather than performance. Sarah Kim's morning began with her usual efficiency, checking emails while preparing breakfast for her family and mentally organizing the day's schedule of school meetings, volunteer commitments, and social obligations. As PTA president, her phone buzzed constantly with requests for decisions about fundraising events, policy questions about school procedures, and updates about various committee activities that required her coordination and approval. The responsibility of managing so many community connections had given Sarah a comprehensive overview of Maplewood Village's social dynamics, making her acutely aware of which residents were actively engaged in neighborhood improvement and which seemed content to remain on the sidelines of community life. Her position required constant evaluation of who could be counted on for volunteer work, who had the skills necessary for specific projects, and who might need gentle encouragement to participate more fully in community activities. Margaret Henderson represented a particular puzzle in Sarah's mental map of neighborhood resources and relationships. Despite living in Maplewood Village for over 15 years, Margaret remained largely disconnected from the social networks that Sarah considered essential for both personal fulfillment and community health. Her minimal participation in organized activities seemed wasteful to Sarah, who couldn't understand why someone with so much free time wouldn't welcome opportunities for social engagement and meaningful contribution. Sarah's attempts to include Margaret in various volunteer opportunities had met with polite but unenthusiastic responses that frustrated her commitment to ensuring that every resident felt valued and included. She had offered Margaret roles in bake sales, holiday decorating committees, and charitable fundraising events, always selecting activities that seemed appropriate for her age and apparent physical limitations while providing opportunities for social interaction and community service. But Margaret's lukewarm participation in these activities had convinced Sarah that more direct intervention might be necessary to address what appeared to be depression, social anxiety, or simply the stubborn independence that sometimes prevented elderly residents from accepting help they clearly needed. Sarah had begun considering whether to suggest that Margaret might benefit from professional counseling or social services designed to support isolated seniors. The irony of Sarah's concern was that it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Margaret's priorities and capabilities. While Sarah interpreted Margaret's limited social engagement as evidence of loneliness and decline, Margaret was actually quite content with her current lifestyle and had no particular desire for the kind of organized community involvement that Sarah valued so highly. Margaret's priorities were focused on maintaining her independence, managing her own affairs, and contributing to the community in ways that felt meaningful to her, rather than simply participating in activities designed by others for their own satisfaction. Her volunteer work at the local food bank, her informal assistance to other elderly neighbors, and her consistent participation in environmental cleanup efforts went largely unnoticed by Sarah, who was looking for different forms of engagement and contribution. The disconnect between Sarah's expectations and Margaret's actual interests had created a situation where both women remained frustrated with their interactions, neither understanding the other's perspective or recognizing the validity of different approaches to community involvement and social connection. Sarah's well-intentioned efforts to help Margaret felt patronizing and irrelevant, while Margaret's independent approach to community service seemed antisocial and ungrateful to Sarah's organized sensibilities. This mutual misunderstanding had become emblematic of the broader generational divide within Maplewood Village, where different definitions of valuable contribution and meaningful engagement created parallel communities that rarely intersected in productive ways. The result was a loss of potential collaboration and mutual support that weakened the overall social fabric while leaving both sides feeling misunderstood and underappreciated. Officer James Rodriguez had been patrolling the Maplewood Village area for 3 years, long enough to become familiar with the neighborhood's rhythms and residents, but not long enough to feel completely integrated into the community's social dynamics. His patrol route included the elementary school, the shopping district, and the residential streets where he had learned to recognize the faces and vehicles that belonged to the area's daily routines. The neighborhood had earned a reputation within the police department as one of the easier assignments, with crime rates well below the city average and most calls involving minor property disputes, noise complaints, or routine traffic violations. The residents were generally cooperative and respectful, their interactions with law enforcement professional and brief, creating an environment where community policing could focus on prevention and relationship building rather than crisis response and enforcement. Rodriguez had noticed Margaret Henderson during his regular patrols, primarily because her early morning activity in her garden made her one of the few residents visible during his dawn shifts. He had developed the habit of slowing his patrol car as he passed her house, partly from professional curiosity about her consistent outdoor work and partly from a general concern for elderly residents who might be vulnerable to crime or medical emergencies. But Rodriguez's observations of Margaret had gradually shifted his perception of her from potential victim to capable resident who deserved the same respect he gave to any community member managing their own affairs responsibly. Her garden showed clear evidence of successful planning and maintenance. Her property was well kept and secure, and her behavior suggested someone who was alert, purposeful, and perfectly capable of taking care of herself. The contrast between Margaret's actual presentation and the community's apparent perception of her as fragile and needy had struck Rodriguez as oddly familiar, reminding him of his own grandmother, who had been consistently underestimated by family members who confused age with incapacity. His law enforcement training had taught him to observe behavior rather than make assumptions based on appearance, and Margaret's behavior suggested competence rather than vulnerability. Rodriguez's professional experience had also given him insight into the difference between people who could be counted on during emergencies and those who might require assistance or protection. Margaret's calm demeanor, purposeful activity, and obvious self-sufficiency suggested someone who would respond well to crisis situations rather than panic or freeze when quick action was needed. But Rodriguez's positive assessment of Margaret's capabilities remained largely professional and private, part of his mental catalog of neighborhood resources and potential assets rather than information he had shared with other community members. His role as a police officer created certain boundaries around personal relationships with residents, limiting his ability to participate in the social networks where perceptions and assumptions about neighbors were formed and reinforced. Afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the elementary school parking lot as parents began arriving for the 3:15 pickup that marked the end of another school day. The familiar chaos of cars maneuvering for advantageous positions, children streaming from classroom doors, and adults managing multiple conversations while keeping track of their responsibilities, created an atmosphere of controlled urgency that had become routine for everyone involved. Margaret Henderson had volunteered for pickup duty that day, helping to supervise the crossing zone where children walked from the school building to the designated parent pickup area. Her bright orange safety vest and handheld stop sign marked her as one of the official volunteers, though few parents paid particular attention to her presence among the more recognizable faces who typically manage these daily logistics. The volunteer schedule had assigned her to this duty partly because it required minimal physical exertion and could be performed by residents who might not be suitable for more demanding community service roles. The position was considered appropriate for elderly volunteers who wanted to contribute but couldn't handle the organizational responsibilities or sustained activity required for other school support functions. But Margaret had requested the crossing guard assignment, specifically because it allowed her to observe the school's safety procedures and identify potential improvements that might prevent accidents or injuries. Her background at steelworks manufacturing had included extensive safety training and accident prevention protocols, giving her expertise in recognizing hazardous conditions and developing effective countermeasures for protecting people in busy, potentially dangerous environments. During her weeks of volunteer service, Margaret had noticed several concerning patterns in the parking lot's traffic flow and pedestrian management that created unnecessary risks for children, parents, and volunteers. The spacing between designated pickup zones didn't account for the turning radius of larger vehicles, creating blind spots where children might not be visible to drivers. The timing of signal changes didn't provide adequate buffer time for slower-moving pedestrians to clear intersections safely. Margaret had drafted a detailed memo outlining these safety concerns and recommending specific modifications to improve protection for everyone using the school pickup area. But her suggestions had been politely acknowledged and then effectively ignored by the PTA Safety Committee, which had already developed its own procedures and didn't see the need for input from volunteers who weren't part of the official planning process. The dismissal of Margaret's safety recommendations had been handled with the same gentle condescension that characterized most of the community's interactions with elderly residents. Her concerns were treated as well-meaning but naive, the kind of worrying that older people did when they didn't fully understand how systems actually worked or why certain procedures had been established by more qualified authorities. But Margaret's safety training had taught her to distinguish between reasonable precautions and unnecessary anxiety, and her observations about the school parking lot were based on professional expertise rather than casual worry. The hazards she had identified were real and potentially serious, requiring attention from people with the authority to implement necessary changes before those hazards resulted in actual injuries. The irony was that Margaret's safety expertise was exactly what the school community needed, but didn't recognize it possessed. While the PTA Safety Committee focused on policies and procedures that looked comprehensive on paper, Margaret was identifying practical, specific risks that could cause real harm to children and families who trusted the school's commitment to providing a safe environment for pickup and drop-off activities. Tommy Chun had been looking forward to this particular afternoon because his mother had promised to take him to the new playground after school pickup, weather permitting. At 6 years old, Tommy possessed the kind of boundless energy and curiosity that made every ordinary day feel full of potential adventure, and the prospect of trying out playground equipment he had only seen from the car window had occupied his thoughts throughout the school day. The playground visit depended on his mother finishing her work calls early enough to allow time for play before dinner. Tommy Chun clutched his superhero backpack as he emerged from the classroom, scanning the familiar chaos of the pickup area. For his mother's silver Honda among the growing line of vehicles, the playground equipment visible beyond the school fence had captured his imagination all week, its colorful climbing structures and spinning components promising adventures that would far exceed the limited entertainment options in his own backyard. His teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had assigned him to wait in the designated safe zone near the main exit while she managed the complex logistics of matching 32 first graders with their appropriate transportation arrangements. The system worked efficiently most days, but Tommy's natural curiosity and boundless energy made staying still in one place feel like an impossible challenge, especially when interesting sights and sounds competed for his attention. The soccer ball that would change everything had been forgotten under the climbing structure during morning recess, its bright orange surface barely visible among the scattered wood chips and fallen leaves that accumulated in the playground's corners. Tommy had spotted it during lunch break and made a mental note to retrieve it after school, knowing that soccer balls belonged to the shared equipment collection and needed to be returned to the proper storage area. Mrs. Patterson's attention was divided between managing her remaining students, coordinating with other teachers about transportation changes, and responding to parents who had questions about homework assignments or upcoming field trip permissions. The afternoon pickup routine required constant vigilance and quick decision-making, but it had become such an established pattern that most adults performed their roles automatically while discussing weekend plans or scheduling playdates for their children. Tommy waited until Mrs. Patterson was engaged in conversation with another parent before making his move toward the playground area, reasoning that retrieving the forgotten soccer ball would take only a few seconds and that his mother's arrival was still several minutes away based on her usual timing. His 6-year-old logic didn't account for the various safety protocols that prohibited students from leaving the designated pickup zone without adult supervision. The fence separating the pickup area from the playground was designed to prevent exactly this kind of unsupervised exploration, but Tommy had discovered during previous weeks that a loose section near the corner allowed just enough space for a small child to squeeze through if they were determined and flexible enough. The gap had been reported to the maintenance staff but hadn't yet been repaired, creating a temporary vulnerability in the school's carefully planned safety systems. Tommy's passage through the fence went unnoticed by the adults who were focused on their own responsibilities and conversations. The pickup area's controlled chaos provided enough distraction that one small boy's brief absence didn't immediately trigger concern or intervention. The assumption was that all students would remain in their assigned waiting areas until properly dismissed to their authorized transportation, making Tommy's unauthorized expedition effectively invisible to the supervisory system. The soccer ball lay partially hidden beneath the wooden climbing structure, requiring Tommy to crawl into a space that was clearly designed for children his size but felt adventurous and slightly forbidden given his current unauthorized status in the playground area. His superhero backpack caught briefly on the wooden supports, forcing him to remove it and push it ahead of him as he maneuvered toward his target. The retrieval process took longer than Tommy had anticipated, partly because the ball had become wedged between two support posts and partly because his excitement about the playground equipment distracted him from his original mission. The climbing structure featured handholds and pathways that seemed perfectly designed for exploration, and Tommy couldn't resist testing a few of the easier climbing routes while he was already in the area. Margaret Henderson had positioned herself at the crossing station closest to the playground area, her orange safety vest bright against the late afternoon sun as she maintained her watch over the intersection where children and vehicles shared the same space. Her attention was naturally drawn to movement patterns that seemed unusual or potentially problematic, a habit developed through years of safety training that had taught her to notice anomalies before they became emergencies. The gap in the fence near the playground corner had been on Margaret's mental list of safety concerns since her first day of volunteer duty, but her previous reports about the vulnerability had been acknowledged politely and then apparently forgotten by the maintenance staff who had more pressing repair priorities. The loose section created exactly the kind of unsupervised access point that safety protocols were designed to prevent. Margaret's peripheral vision caught the movement of Tommy squeezing through the fence gap, and she immediately began moving toward the playground area while maintaining her radio contact with the other crossing guards to ensure proper coverage of her assigned intersection. Her response was automatic and professional, based on safety training that prioritized prevention over reaction and emphasized the importance of maintaining supervision boundaries for children in potentially hazardous environments. But Margaret's approach to the playground was interrupted by a parent who needed assistance locating her child among the various pickup zones, and by the time she had resolved that situation and returned her attention to the playground area, Tommy had disappeared into the climbing structure and was no longer visible from her position. The brief delay had created a gap in supervision that would prove crucial in the developing situation. The black SUV belonged to Jennifer Walsh, a busy real estate agent who had rushed to the school pickup after canceling 2 client meetings to accommodate her daughter's early dismissal for a dental appointment. Jennifer's phone had been buzzing with work calls throughout the drive to school, and she had pulled into the parking lot while still managing the conversation about property listings that required immediate attention and couldn't wait until after pickup duties were completed. Jennifer's SUV was larger than most vehicles in the school parking lot, chosen for its safety features and cargo capacity rather than maneuverability in tight spaces. The vehicle's size provided excellent protection for her family, but created challenges in parking areas designed for smaller cars, requiring careful navigation and precise positioning to avoid blocking traffic flow or creating hazards for pedestrians. The real estate call had been more complex than Jennifer anticipated, involving contract negotiations that required her immediate input on pricing strategies and closing timelines. Her attention was divided between the legal details being discussed on her phone and the practical requirements of parking safely in the increasingly crowded pickup area, where other parents were competing for convenient positions near the school entrance. Jennifer's parking attempt was further complicated by another parent who had stopped their vehicle in the designated traffic lane to have a conversation with a friend, creating a bottleneck that forced arriving parents to navigate around the obstruction while managing their own pickup logistics. The result was a parking situation that required more attention and precision than Jennifer could provide while simultaneously handling her work emergency. The SUV's position when Jennifer finally ended her phone call and engaged the parking brake was technically within the designated parking space, but at an angle that left the rear of the vehicle extending slightly into the pedestrian walkway that connected the playground area to the main pickup zone. The parking job wasn't dramatically incorrect, but it created a subtle narrowing of the walkway that would prove significant when combined with other factors that were beginning to align in dangerous ways. Jennifer's focus immediately shifted to locating her daughter among the organized chaos of the pickup area, checking her phone for text messages about any changes to the usual dismissal routine, while scanning the various waiting areas where children were grouped according to their grade levels and transportation arrangements. Her urgency was heightened by the dental appointment scheduling, which left no buffer time for delays or complications in the pickup process. The SUV sat empty in its imperfect parking position as Jennifer hurried toward the school entrance. Her keys left in the vehicle along with her purse and other personal items. The vehicle's automatic systems had engaged properly, with the engine off and the electronic parking brake activated, but the slight incline of the parking lot created a gravitational stress on the parking brake system that was within normal parameters but represented the maximum load the system was designed to handle. Tommy had successfully retrieved the soccer ball and was beginning his crawl back out from under the climbing structure when he heard his name being called from the pickup area. His mother had arrived earlier than expected and was clearly looking for him in the designated waiting area where he was supposed to be stationed. The realization that he was in unauthorized territory and might be in trouble for leaving his assigned position added urgency to his effort to return quickly and quietly. But Tommy's exit from the climbing structure was more challenging than his entry had been, partly because he was now carrying the soccer ball and his backpack, and partly because his excitement about hearing his mother's voice made him less careful about his movements through the confined space. His superhero backpack caught on one of the wooden supports, jerking him backward just as he was emerging from the structure. The sudden stop caused Tommy to lose his grip on the soccer ball, which rolled away from the climbing structure and began bouncing across the playground surface toward the fence gap where he had originally entered the area. The ball's movement was erratic and unpredictable, following a path that would take it directly into the pedestrian walkway where Jennifer's SUV was parked at the awkward angle that narrowed the available space. Tommy's natural instinct was to chase the runaway soccer ball, both because he felt responsible for returning it to the proper location and because his 6-year-old mind couldn't easily abandon an object that was bouncing away from him in such an entertaining manner. His pursuit of the ball took him through the fence gap and into the pedestrian walkway, just as several other factors were beginning to converge in ways that would transform a routine afternoon into a life-threatening emergency. The mechanical failure that set the final sequence of events in motion was subtle and initially undetectable, the kind of system malfunction that safety engineers spend careers trying to prevent, but occasionally cannot eliminate entirely from complex mechanical systems. Jennifer's SUV had been manufactured with redundant safety systems designed to prevent exactly this type of failure, but the combination of the parking lot's incline, the vehicle's weight distribution, and a microscopic flaw in the electronic parking brake mechanism created a perfect storm of circumstances that overwhelmed the design safety margins. The electronic parking brake had engaged properly when Jennifer activated it, applying the correct amount of pressure to the brake discs and sending the appropriate confirmation signals to the vehicle's computer systems. But a tiny piece of debris that had accumulated over months of normal driving had worked its way into a critical component of the brake mechanism, creating a microscopic gap that allowed brake fluid pressure to decrease gradually over the course of several minutes. The pressure loss was occurring so slowly that the vehicle's monitoring systems didn't recognize it as a malfunction requiring immediate warning signals or automatic intervention. The rate of pressure decline was within the parameters that the computer interpreted as normal system variation rather than catastrophic failure, allowing the problem to develop undetected while the SUV remained apparently secure in its parking position. Tommy's chase after the soccer ball had brought him into the pedestrian walkway at precisely the moment when the brake pressure reached the critical threshold, where the SUV's weight began to overcome the diminishing force holding it in position. The massive vehicle started its movement with an almost imperceptible rolling, motion that quickly accelerated as gravity and momentum took control of the 3-ton mass. The SUV's initial movement was silent and smooth, without the dramatic sounds or obvious visual cues that might have warned nearby pedestrians about the developing danger. The vehicle's motion appeared almost intentional, as if someone had started the engine and begun backing out of the parking space normally, making it difficult for observers to immediately recognize that an emergency was unfolding. Tommy was focused entirely on recovering the soccer ball, which had come to rest against the rear tire of Jennifer's SUV, just as the vehicle began its dangerous movement. His 6-year-old perspective didn't include the knowledge necessary to recognize that the large vehicle above him was no longer safely stationary, and his natural instinct was to reach for the ball that lay tantalizingly close to his grasp. Margaret Henderson's position at the crossing station gave her a clear view of the pedestrian walkway, where Tommy had entered his pursuit of the soccer ball, but her attention was momentarily divided by a question from another parent about the location of the lost and found office for retrieving a child's forgotten jacket. The brief conversation delayed her recognition of the developing emergency by crucial seconds that would determine whether intervention was possible or whether the situation would unfold beyond anyone's ability to prevent tragedy. The SUV's movement accelerated as it rolled down the slight incline of the parking lot, its 3-ton mass building momentum that would soon make stopping impossible through any normal means. The vehicle's path was taking it directly toward the area where Tommy was reaching for the soccer ball, creating a collision course that would result in catastrophic injury or death unless someone could intervene immediately and effectively. David Martinez had finished his post-workout consultation with a potential new client and was walking toward his truck when he noticed the unusual movement in the school parking lot. His fitness-trained reflexes and competitive athlete's situational awareness allowed him to recognize quickly that something was wrong with the way the black SUV was moving, but his position was too far from the vehicle to allow any direct intervention. David's immediate instinct was to shout a warning to anyone in the area, but the distance and ambient noise of the pickup area made it unlikely that his voice would reach the people who needed to hear it. His muscular physique and athletic conditioning were impressive within the controlled environment of the gym, but they offered no advantage in a situation that required immediate action across a distance too great for him to cover in time to make a difference. Frank Russo had been driving past the school when he noticed the commotion in the parking lot, his professional eye automatically assessing the mechanical situation as he observed the SUV's uncontrolled movement toward the pedestrian area. His years of experience with automotive systems allowed him to understand immediately what was happening and why, but his position outside the school property meant that any assistance he might offer would come too late to prevent the collision. Sarah Kim had been walking toward her car when she noticed the developing emergency, her organizational skills and community leadership experience creating an immediate impulse to take charge of the situation and coordinate an effective response. But the crisis was unfolding too quickly for the kind of systematic, problem-solving approach that had made her effective in other community situations, requiring instead the kind of instant physical action that her background hadn't prepared her to provide. Officer Rodriguez was responding to a routine traffic call 3 blocks away when his radio crackled with the first emergency report from the school. But even with lights and sirens activated, his patrol car couldn't cover the distance quickly enough to influence the outcome of events that were already reaching their critical phase. His law enforcement training had taught him to assess situations quickly and respond appropriately. But some emergencies developed faster than any response system could handle. The witnesses who were close enough to see what was happening found themselves frozen by the shock of watching a preventable tragedy unfold in slow motion, their minds struggling to process the reality that a child was about to be crushed by a vehicle that seemed to be moving with deadly inevitability toward its target. The human tendency to freeze during sudden emergencies was working against Tommy's survival, leaving everyone watching helplessly as the SUV continued its inexorable progress toward disaster. Margaret Henderson's safety training had included extensive instruction on the importance of immediate action during emergencies, emphasizing that the first few seconds of any crisis were the most crucial for preventing catastrophic outcomes. Her experience at steelworks manufacturing had exposed her to situations where hesitation meant the difference between injury and death, teaching her to respond automatically when she recognized danger rather than waiting to analyze all the options. The moment Margaret's attention returned to the pedestrian walkway and she saw Tommy reaching for the soccer ball beneath the moving SUV, her response was immediate and unthinking. Her body moved before her conscious mind had time to calculate the risks or consider alternatives. Decades of industrial safety training, overriding any concerns about her own physical limitations or the opinions of observers who might question her capabilities. Margaret's sprint toward the collision point was unlike anything the Maplewood village community had ever seen from the quiet, elderly woman who tended her garden and volunteered for simple tasks that seemed appropriate for someone her age. Her movement was purposeful and powerful, covering ground with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly what needed to be done and how much time she had to accomplish it. The distance between Margaret's crossing station and Tommy's position beneath the SUV was approximately 40 yards, a gap that needed to be covered in the few seconds before the vehicle's momentum would make rescue impossible. Her aging legs responded to the emergency with strength that had been dormant but never lost, calling upon reserves of power that had been built through decades of physical labor and maintained through years of gardening and household maintenance. That had seemed routine to observers but had actually served as ongoing conditioning for exactly this kind of crisis. Margaret's approach to the collision point was calculated and strategic, her industrial safety background providing the knowledge necessary to assess the vehicle's momentum, trajectory, and the precise timing required to extract Tommy from danger. Without putting herself directly in the path of the 3-ton SUV, her intervention would need to be perfectly executed, with no margin for error and no opportunity for a second attempt if her first effort failed. The community that had dismissed Margaret Henderson as too old and frail to matter was about to witness a demonstration of capability that would challenge everything they thought they understood about strength, courage, and the nature of heroism. When ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances, the quiet woman who had been overlooked and underestimated was about to prove that true power often came from the most unexpected sources, and that the most important battles were often fought by those who had never sought recognition for their ability to fight them. As Margaret closed the distance between herself and the developing tragedy, her mind was calculating angles, timing, and force requirements with the precision of someone whose survival had once depended on making exactly these kinds of split-second decisions under life-threatening pressure. The SUV's movement was accelerating as gravity pulled its massive weight down the inclined parking lot, but Margaret's experience told her that she still had a narrow window of opportunity to change the outcome if she could reach Tommy before the vehicle's momentum became unstoppable. The soccer ball that had started this entire sequence of events lay forgotten as Tommy looked up to see the massive vehicle bearing down on him, his 6-year-old mind finally understanding that he was in danger but lacking the experience necessary to determine how to escape from his position beneath the SUV. His natural instinct was to freeze rather than move, a reaction that would prove fatal unless someone else took control of the situation immediately. Margaret's final steps toward the collision point were accompanied by the kind of focused clarity that emergency responders recognize as the mental state necessary for performing under ultimate pressure. Her years of safety training, her decades of physical labor, her lifetime of taking responsibility for protecting others when protection was needed, all combined to prepare her for the moment when she would need to demonstrate exactly who she had always been beneath the surface that her community had never bothered to see. The black SUV continued its deadly progress toward Tommy Chun, its 3-ton mass building the kind of momentum that would crush anything in its path unless someone with the strength, knowledge, and courage to intervene could reach the collision point in time to prevent a tragedy that would haunt the Maplewood Village community forever. Margaret Henderson was running out of time, but she was not running out of determination or capability, and the next few seconds would reveal whether a lifetime of hidden strength would be enough to save a child's life when everyone else could only watch in horror as the unthinkable unfolded before their eyes. The sound of Margaret's footsteps on the asphalt was lost in the ambient noise of the pickup area, where parents continued their conversations and children played their games, most of them still unaware that an emergency was developing just yards from their own positions. The tragedy was unfolding in the kind of terrible isolation that characterized most real emergencies, where the people who most needed help were separated from the people who might provide it by distances measured seconds that felt like eternity. Tommy's mother had finally spotted him beneath the SUV and was beginning to run toward him, her high heels clicking against the pavement as she called his name with the kind of desperate urgency that every parent recognized, but hoped never to experience. But Jennifer's position and her inappropriate footwear for running meant that she would reach her son several seconds after the collision occurred, making her a witness to tragedy rather than a participant in rescue. Margaret Henderson was now the only person with both the position and the capability to prevent the unthinkable from happening, her elderly frame carrying the hopes of everyone who would spend the rest of their lives wondering what they could have done differently if they had been close enough or strong enough or brave enough to act when action was desperately needed. The moment of truth was approaching rapidly, and everything that happened next would depend on whether a 72-year-old grandmother possessed the physical power necessary to stop 3 tons of rolling steel before it crushed a 6-year-old boy who had simply been trying to retrieve a soccer ball from underneath a parked car. The final 10 yards between Margaret Henderson and the collision point stretched before her like an eternity compressed into seconds, each step requiring every ounce of strength and determination she had accumulated over 7 decades of life. The SUV's momentum was building with terrifying inevitability, its 3-ton mass accelerating down the slight incline of the parking lot toward Tommy Chun, who remained frozen beneath the vehicle with the kind of paralysis that grips children when they suddenly understand they are in mortal danger, but lack the experience to know how to save themselves. Margaret's approach to the crisis was informed by 30 years of industrial safety training that had taught her to assess mechanical hazards quickly and respond with calculated precision rather than panic or hesitation. Her mind was automatically calculating the vehicle's weight distribution, the angle of approach that would give her maximum leverage, and the precise timing required to extract Tommy from his position beneath the SUV before the rolling mass became unstoppable by any human intervention. The knowledge that had once made Margaret invaluable on the factory floor was now focused entirely on solving the most critical problem of her life, applying principles of physics and mechanical advantage that most people never learned, but that had been essential skills for anyone who worked around heavy machinery and understood how forces could be redirected and controlled through proper technique and positioning. Margaret's final sprint toward Tommy required her to angle her approach carefully, positioning herself so that she could reach the child while simultaneously placing herself in the optimal position to attempt stopping or redirecting the SUV's movement. Her 72-year-old body was responding to the emergency with reserves of power that surprised even her, drawing upon muscle memory and cardiovascular conditioning that had been maintained through years of physical labor disguised as routine household maintenance and gardening. The moment of impact between Margaret and the crisis arrived with crystalline clarity as she dropped to her knees beside Tommy and wrapped her arms around his small body, lifting him clear of the SUV's path in one fluid motion that combined maternal instinct with technical expertise in safely moving a person from a dangerous position. Tommy's weight was negligible compared to the machinery components and industrial materials Margaret had manipulated throughout her working career, making his extraction from beneath the vehicle almost effortless despite the extreme circumstances. But removing Tommy from immediate danger was only the first part of Margaret's intervention, because the SUV's continued movement meant that other children and parents in the pickup area remained at risk unless someone could stop the 3-ton vehicle before it reached the main pedestrian zones where the afternoon's activities were continuing, largely unaware of the developing catastrophe. Margaret's decision to attempt stopping the SUV directly was made without conscious deliberation, her emergency response training taking control of her actions as she positioned Tommy safely to one side and turned to face the rolling vehicle. With the kind of focused determination that had once allowed her to shut down malfunctioning industrial equipment when failure would have endangered entire work crews. The physics of stopping a 3-ton SUV through human intervention seemed impossible to observers, who understood vehicles primarily as transportation rather than as mechanical systems, subject to the same principles of leverage and force redirection that governed all heavy machinery. But Margaret's 3 decades of experience with industrial equipment had taught her that even the largest and most powerful machines had specific points where relatively small forces could be applied to achieve dramatic results. Margaret's approach to the SUV was strategically calculated, targeting the vehicle's front corner where the combination of her body weight, proper leverage, and the mechanical advantage created by the SUV's own momentum could be redirected to alter its trajectory enough to prevent catastrophic collision with the populated areas of the pickup zone. The moment when Margaret's hands made contact with the SUV's front bumper was witnessed by dozens of parents and school staff who would later struggle to describe exactly what they had seen, because the visual reality of a 72-year-old woman in a floral dress physically redirecting a 3-ton vehicle challenged their fundamental assumptions about human capability and the relationship between apparent frailty and actual strength. Margaret's technique for stopping the SUV drew upon everything she had learned about managing heavy machinery under emergency conditions, using her entire body as a lever system while positioning her feet to maximize traction and applying force at precisely the angle that would most effectively counter the vehicle's momentum, without putting herself at risk of being crushed by the mass she was attempting to control. The success of Margaret's intervention depended not on overpowering the SUV through brute strength, but on understanding how to work with the vehicle's own physics to redirect its energy in ways that would dissipate the dangerous momentum while bringing the rolling mass to a controlled stop. Her hands guided the SUV's movement rather than simply opposing it, using techniques that were invisible to observers, but crucial for achieving results that seemed impossible through conventional understanding of human physical limitations. The SUV's deceleration under Margaret's guidance was gradual but decisive, its momentum bleeding away as she maintained pressure on the vehicle's front corner while adjusting her own position to keep herself out of the path of the wheels that could still cause serious injury even as the overall speed decreased. Her movements were precise and economical, wasting no energy on ineffective efforts while maintaining the kind of sustained pressure that gradually brought the 3-ton mass under control. The sound of the SUV's tires finally coming to a complete stop on the asphalt was followed by a moment of absolute silence as the witnesses processed what they had just observed, their minds struggling to reconcile the impossible sight of Margaret Henderson successfully preventing a tragedy that should have been beyond any individual's power to influence. Tommy Chun remained safely positioned where Margaret had placed him, his 6-year-old mind still catching up with the reality that the danger had passed, and that the quiet grandmother who helped with school crossings had somehow transformed into the person who had saved his life. His mother reached him seconds later, gathering him into her arms while staring at Margaret with the kind of grateful disbelief that comes when someone realizes their child has been rescued from certain death by the most unlikely of heroes. David Martinez had witnessed the entire sequence from his position near the gym parking lot, his athlete's understanding of human performance leaving him speechless as he tried to process how Margaret had accomplished something that his own muscular physique and training would not have equipped him to attempt. The demonstration of practical strength and emergency response capability had revealed the profound difference between fitness that looked impressive and strength that actually mattered. When lives hung in the balance, Frank Russo had arrived just in time to see Margaret's final moments of controlling the SUV's movement, his mechanical expertise allowing him to understand immediately that her technique was not accidental, but represented sophisticated knowledge of how forces could be applied and redirected to achieve results that appeared miraculous to observers who lacked similar technical background. Sarah Kim found herself reevaluating everything she thought she knew about community resources and the capabilities of residents she had unconsciously categorized as needing assistance rather than being able to provide it. Margaret's heroic intervention had demonstrated that the neighborhood's most valuable assets might not be the most visible or socially prominent members, but rather the quiet individuals whose expertise and strength had been overlooked by social dynamics that prioritized appearance over substance. Officer Rodriguez arrived on scene within minutes of receiving the emergency call, his law enforcement training immediately recognizing that Margaret's actions had prevented what would have been a devastating tragedy, requiring extensive emergency response and likely resulting in multiple casualties. His report would document the incident as a successful civilian intervention that had averted a catastrophic accident through quick thinking and effective action. The crowd that gathered around Margaret and Tommy in the aftermath of the crisis included parents who had never spoken to her before, but who now understood that their own children's safety had been protected by someone they had consistently ignored or dismissed. The revelation that Margaret possessed both the knowledge and physical capability to respond effectively to life-threatening emergencies forced an immediate reconsideration of assumptions that had shaped community interactions for years. Jennifer Walsh returned to find her SUV stopped safely and her parking brake failure transformed from a source of devastating guilt into a story of miraculous intervention by a neighbor she had never properly acknowledged. The mechanical problem that could have destroyed multiple lives had instead become the catalyst for recognizing that Maplewood Village's most valuable resident had been hiding in plain sight while everyone else focused on more obvious forms of achievement and capability. The school principal and safety coordinator arrived to assess the situation and found themselves confronting the reality that their established safety procedures had been inadequate to prevent the emergency, and that their volunteer crossing guard had possessed exactly the expertise they needed, but had never thought to utilize in planning and protocol development. Margaret's immediate concern after ensuring Tommy's safety was returning to her assigned crossing guard position, but the other volunteers and school staff insisted that she remain available to provide a statement about the incident and to receive medical evaluation to ensure that her physical intervention hadn't resulted in any injuries that might require treatment. The medical assessment revealed that Margaret had emerged from her confrontation with the 3-ton SUV without any significant injuries, her technique for managing the vehicle's forces having protected her from the crushing or impact injuries that might have resulted from a less knowledgeable approach to the crisis. Her vital signs were those of someone who had experienced significant physical exertion, but who possessed the cardiovascular conditioning necessary to handle emergency situations without suffering adverse health effects. The investigation into the SUV's mechanical failure confirmed that the parking brake malfunction had been caused by a manufacturing defect that could not have been predicted or prevented through normal vehicle maintenance, absolving Jennifer Walsh of responsibility while highlighting the random nature of emergencies that could transform ordinary situations into life-threatening crises without warning. Margaret's background in industrial safety became a subject of intense interest as community members learned about her 3 decades of experience with heavy machinery and emergency response protocols that had prepared her uniquely for the kind of crisis that had just unfolded in their peaceful suburban neighborhood. Her expertise represented exactly the kind of resource that emergency planners valued but rarely found available in residential communities. The school district's Safety Review Board requested a meeting with Margaret to discuss her observations about potential hazards in the pickup area and to explore whether her industrial safety background could contribute to improving protection protocols for students, staff, and families during daily transportation routines. David Martinez approached Margaret privately to apologize for his assumptions about her capabilities and to express his admiration for her demonstration of strength and courage under extreme pressure. His fitness expertise had taught him to recognize exceptional physical performance, and Margaret's intervention had displayed exactly the kind of functional strength and mental toughness that he most respected in elite athletes. Sarah Kim organized an impromptu community gathering to acknowledge Margaret's heroic actions and to discuss how the neighborhood could better utilize the expertise and capabilities of all residents, rather than making assumptions based on age, appearance, or social visibility. The near tragedy had revealed that their community's greatest assets might not be their most obvious leaders. Frank Russo offered to inspect Margaret's truck and provide any necessary mechanical services free of charge, recognizing that her vehicle had been essential to maintaining the independence and physical conditioning that had enabled her to respond effectively when emergency action was required. The local newspaper sent a reporter to interview Margaret about her background and the circumstances that had led to her successful intervention, but Margaret declined to discuss her personal history extensively, preferring to focus on the importance of emergency preparedness and community awareness of potential safety hazards. Tommy Chun's family invited Margaret to dinner as a gesture of gratitude that seemed inadequate compared to the debt they owed her for saving their son's life, but which represented their sincere appreciation for her willingness to risk her own safety to protect a child she barely knew. The video footage from the school's security cameras became a subject of intense analysis as viewers tried to understand exactly how Margaret had managed to stop the SUV through techniques that seemed to defy conventional understanding of human physical limitations. The recording provided objective documentation of an intervention that might otherwise have been dismissed as exaggerated testimony from emotionally overwhelmed witnesses. Margaret's return to her regular volunteer schedule the following week was marked by a completely transformed dynamic in her interactions with other community members, who now understood that her quiet competence represented genuine expertise, rather than the stubborn independence they had previously attributed to her behavior. The maintenance staff expedited repairs to the fence gap that had allowed Tommy to enter the playground area unsupervised, implementing Margaret's previous safety recommendations that had been overlooked when they came from someone whose expertise was not yet recognized by the school administration. The HOA meeting, held 2 weeks after the incident, featured a formal recognition of Margaret's heroic actions and a discussion of how the community could better identify and utilize the diverse skills and capabilities that existed among residents who might not fit the typical profile of neighborhood leaders. David Martinez began incorporating Margaret's approach to functional strength and emergency preparedness into his training programs, recognizing that his clients needed to develop the kind of practical capability that could be applied outside the controlled environment of the gym when real-world situations demanded immediate and effective action. The fitness culture at Riverside Fitness evolved to include more emphasis on practical strength and emergency response training, with Margaret serving as an informal consultant who helped members understand how physical conditioning could be applied to protecting themselves and others during unexpected crises. Margaret's garden became a gathering place for neighbors who wanted to learn about the practical skills and physical conditioning that had enabled her to respond so effectively when lives were at stake, transforming her previously isolated property into a center for community education about preparedness and capability development. The transformation of Margaret Henderson from overlooked elderly resident to recognized community hero illustrated the profound difference between strength that sought recognition and strength that quietly prepared itself to act when action was needed most. Her intervention had saved Tommy Chun's life, but it had also saved the Maplewood Village community from living with the devastating knowledge that they had failed to protect one of their children when protection was possible. The legacy of Margaret's heroic actions extended far beyond the immediate rescue, creating lasting changes in how the community understood capability, leadership, and the importance of recognizing valuable resources regardless of their packaging or presentation. The woman who had been dismissed as too old and frail to matter had proven that true strength often came from the most unexpected sources, and that the most important contributions were often made by those who never sought credit for their willingness to serve others when service was desperately needed. The afternoon sun continued to shine on the Maplewood Village Elementary School as parents and children resumed their normal pickup routines, but everyone present understood that their community had been forever changed by witnessing what was possible when someone with genuine capability chose to act with courage and determination, when courage and determination were the only things standing between tragedy and triumph. Margaret Henderson returned to her crossing guard position with the same quiet dignity she had always displayed, but she carried with her the knowledge that her neighbors now understood exactly who she was and what she was capable of when circumstances demanded her unique combination of strength, experience, and unshakable commitment to protecting others, regardless of the personal cost or risk involved. The story of the grandmother who lifted a car would be told and retold throughout Maplewood Village for years to come, serving as a reminder that heroism often came from the most unlikely sources, and that true strength was measured not by appearance or reputation, but by willingness to act when action was needed most, regardless of whether anyone was watching or whether recognition would ever follow. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.